Welcome to Starbound. My name is Aram. I'll be your narrator for today. But before we get into today's story, please check below to see if you've subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and just allows our videos to show up on your feed more often. The collar felt heavier today. Athos Rowe straightened her shoulders as she approached the grand chamber doors, ignoring how the metal band pressed against her throat. After 26 years in diplomatic service, the collar had become like a second skin, a constant reminder of humanity's place in the cosmos. A lifetime of careful conversation, of weighing every syllable against its worth, had brought her to this precipice. Some humans never used more than a few thousand words their entire lives, hoarding them like treasures. Others spent freely in youth, then lived decades in enforced silence. Athos had walked the narrow line between, using her words for humanity, not herself. And today, of all her days, she hopes that she has enough words for what will come. The Valix guards flanking the entrance stared through her rather than at her. Their dark skin pulsed with golden veins that seemed brighter under the artificial lights. One tapped the control panel, and the massive doors slid open to reveal the semicircular council chamber. 7 Valix officials sat on elevated platforms, their veins glowing gold with apparent health and vigor. Below them, human servants stood against walls with downcast eyes, perfect pictures of compliance. Athos knew most by name, but couldn't afford the words to greet them. Mira, who had once shared childhood stories with Athos during late council sessions, now kept her gaze fixed on the polished floor. Darren, whose daughter had received extra rations after Athos's intervention last year, gave an almost imperceptible nod. These tiny acknowledgments, a language of their own. Kielai, the Valix head security official, stood at the center podium. The veins across his face formed patterns more intricate than those of his colleagues, a sign of his high status among the Valix. He had always regarded humans with a mixture of fascination and distaste, like specimens worthy of study, but not respect. "Negotiator Rowe," he said, his voice carrying a musical quality unique to Valix speech. "How fortunate you could join us for these final deliberations." The emphasis on final wasn't subtle. They all knew her word count approached 0. The Valix had probably calculated exactly how many exchanges this negotiation would require, ensuring she'd be silenced before achieving anything meaningful. Athos nodded but remained silent. Every word must count now. Sovan, the council leader, studied Athos with eyes that held neither cruelty nor kindness, merely pragmatic assessment. Of all the Valix officials, Sovan had occasionally shown glimmers of genuine interest in human welfare, though always within the framework of maintaining order.
"We've reviewed your proposals regarding expanded educational access for human children,"
Sovan stated.
"The council finds them ambitious."
The diplomatic euphemism hung in the air. Ambitious, unrealistic, denied. Kielai gestured to the display wall behind him, where images began to appear. Paintings, sketches, digital art, all showing the same thing. Humans without collars, speaking freely.
"These images have been circulating among the human districts," Kielai said. "Our analysts believe they represent more than artistic expression. Insurrection."
The council chamber remained silent as the images continued to cycle. Athos noted the artistry, the technical skill that had gone into creating each piece. Decades of oppression hadn't dulled human creativity. One painting showed a woman with her head thrown back in laughter, mouth open, collar shattered.
Another depicted children in a circle, reading from books, an impossibility under current restrictions that prevented humans from learning written language. "We've apprehended the leader of this movement," Keelai continued. His veins pulsed brighter as he turned to Aethys. "During our recess, perhaps you'd like to meet them, since your diplomatic efforts and their activities seem to be working at cross purposes." Aethys detected the trap immediately. Keelai wanted her to waste words on this diversion, leaving her mute for the actual negotiations. The Valix official's face remained impassive, but she caught the slight pulse of his neck veins, a tell she'd learned indicated anticipation in Valix physiology. She weighed her options. Refusing would appear suspicious. Agreeing might yield information crucial to understanding the real dynamics at play, and something in Keelai's satisfaction suggested this confrontation was inevitable. "Yes," is all she said. The sound seemed to hang in the air, precious and fleeting. Several human servants glanced up momentarily, then quickly resumed their posed compliance. The council leader, an older Valix named Sovan, rose from her seat. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour. This session is in recess." As Aethys turned to follow the guard who had appeared at her side, she caught the gaze of a young human servant named Elian. The woman's eyes flickered toward the exit, then back to Aethys, then to her own hands, which formed a subtle, quick pattern. A warning? A message? The gesture was familiar somehow. As Aethys was escorted from the chamber, the memory surfaced. Her mother's hands forming that same pattern when her neighbor had been taken for re-education after using too many words in public. Danger beyond the obvious. The detention block smelled of antiseptic and fear. Aethys followed the guard through a series of security checkpoints, each more stringent than the last. Other humans passed them in the corridors, maintenance workers and administrative staff, their eyes dropping whenever they saw Aethys's diplomatic insignia. Some looked sympathetic, others resentful. The collar marked them all as the same species, but politics and survival strategies had fractured humanity long ago. Finally, they stopped at a plain door with no markings. 5 minutes, the guard said, pressing his palm to the scanner. The door slid open, and Aethys stepped inside. The woman sitting at the small metal table looked up, and both froze. Iris, her sister. 20 years dissolved in an instant of mutual recognition. Where Aethys had chosen diplomacy, Iris had chosen resistance. Their paths hadn't crossed since their father's memorial service, where they'd argued bitterly over whether working within the system could ever lead to change. Aethys took in her sister's appearance, the small scar above her right eyebrow that hadn't been there before, the way she held herself with coiled tension, ready to spring. Iris had their mother's eyes, sharp and observant, but there was something harder in them now, something that hadn't been there in youth. "Sister," Aethys said. Iris's collar displayed a higher count, but not high enough for someone who should be conserving words for a lifetime. Her eyes narrowed, measuring Aethys from head to toe, taking in the formal diplomatic attire, the perfectly arranged hair, the carefully neutral expression that had become second nature. "Sister," Iris echoed, her voice carrying a hardness Aethys didn't remember. Each held the other's gaze, neither willing to be the first to look away. They stood in silence, communicating through subtle shifts in posture and expression, a language developed by collared humans over generations. Iris's shoulders remained rigid, her jaw tight with resentment. Aethys's hands opened slightly in a gesture of reconciliation. When Iris finally moved, It was to tap a finger silently against her own collar, then gesture to Aethys's counter. Almost out. Was it worth it? The question hovered between them, unspoken but sharp. "The art?" Aethys asked. Iris's mouth curved in something between a smile and a grimace. "Just the beginning," she replied, her finger tapping 3 times on the table, a code meaning larger plan in motion. Fear and something like hope mingled in Aethys's chest. She leaned forward slightly. "What?" Her eyebrows raised. Iris smiled, and her eyes carried determination that made Aethys uneasy. She made a flowing motion with her hand, the movement mothers used when telling children's stories of the ocean. Rising tide, unstoppable. "They'll hurt us," Aethys warned, thinking of riot suppressions she'd witnessed, of collective punishments imposed on entire districts. "Already do." Iris gestured to her collar, then to Aethys's nearly depleted counter. "You failed." The truth of it stung. 26 years of careful diplomacy, of choosing every word with surgical precision, of sacrificing her voice for incremental changes that barely improved human lives. Children still grew up never knowing the pleasure of free speech, of calling out to friends across a playground, of singing. A memory surfaced, their mother teaching them to dance in their tiny apartment, humming because she'd already used her daily word allotment on her work as a medical assistant. Even in silence, she'd found joy, taught them to find it too. "We survive," Aethys countered, thinking of the alternatives. Humanity had tried rebellion before. The result had been death and bondage. What would the retribution be this time? "We endure," Iris corrected. The distinction hung between them, surviving versus living, submission versus dignity. Aethys had dedicated her life to ensuring humanity's survival, to eke out meager victories where she can. Had she sacrificed too much along the way? Before she could respond, the door slid open again. The guard stood there with another Valix official. "Time to return, both of you," the official stated. "The council requests a demonstration." Something cold settled in Aethys's stomach at the word demonstration. Iris stood, smoothing her simple clothing. As they walked side by side down the corridor, she brushed her fingers against Aethys's hand, a gesture their mother had used when they were children. 3 quick touches. "I love you." The council chamber had transformed during the recess. A small platform now stood in the center, surrounded by monitoring equipment. The human servants had been repositioned, clustered near the back of the room. The council members watched with varying expressions as Keelai guided Iris to the platform. Sovan's face remained impassive, though her veins pulsed with a rhythm Aethys had learned indicated discomfort. Younger council member Talon leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. Elder Ramoru appeared bored, having seen too many security measures implemented over his long career to find this one noteworthy. "Colleagues, I present Iris Rowe, leader of the underground art movement," Keelai announced, "and sister to our esteemed human negotiator." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some council members appeared surprised by this revelation, while others seemed unimpressed. Aethys kept her face neutral as she took her position at the diplomatic podium, though her pulse quickened. "Is this relevant?" Sovan asked, her tone suggesting impatience rather than concern. "Entirely," Keelai responded smoothly. "It exemplifies the duplicity we face. One sister negotiates, while the other undermines. Humanity speaks with many voices, not one."
Aethys caught Iris's gaze across the room. Her sister's expression conveyed a complex mix of emotions. Defiance, certainty, and beneath it all,
a flicker of something that might have been regret for the path that had divided them. Keelai lifted a device from a nearby table, a collar nearly identical to those worn by humans, but with additional components embedded in the metal band. Our current collaring system has served adequately for generations, Keelai said, but it addresses only verbal communication. Recent events have highlighted a critical vulnerability. Humans have developed alternative methods of expression. He activated a display showing humans using subtle hand gestures, facial expressions, and physical movements to communicate without words. Aethys recognized many of the signals, the language of the oppressed, developed over generations. The merchant who adjusts her wares 3 times signals price changes to preferred customers, Keelai explained. The maintenance worker who mops in a specific pattern shares information about guard rotations. Children who play certain games in sequence are learning history we've forbidden in schools. Iris's expression didn't change, but Aethys noticed her posture shift slightly. Surprise, perhaps, at how much the Valix had decoded. This prototype addresses that vulnerability, Keelai continued. It monitors not just speech, but also recognizes patterns of gesture and elevated emotional states associated with deception. Young council member Talon frowned. Emotional states? That seems invasive. Security often is, Elder Ramoru remarked dryly. The question is whether it's necessary. Aethys watched as Keelai approached Iris with the new collar. The room fell silent as he removed her standard collar and replaced it with the prototype. Iris remained still, but Aethys could read the tension in her sister's body, the slight tightening around her eyes, the controlled rhythm of her breathing. A simple demonstration, Keelai said, turning to Iris. Do your artistic distributions contain coded messages intended to incite rebellion? The question was masterfully crafted. If Iris answered yes, she admitted to insurrection. If she answered no, the caller would likely detect the lie. Iris met Keelai's gaze directly. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then, can't you tell it's art? The caller remained inactive. Several council members shifted in their seats, interest waning in technology so easily circumvented by linguistic dexterity. Sovan's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. It seems your device requires refinement, Keelai. Keelai's veins pulsed brighter with what Aethys recognized as frustration. This is precisely why such measures are necessary. Human verbal dexterity has always been their most dangerous weapon. He turned to Aethys, and she recognized the tactical shift in his approach. If he couldn't trap Iris directly, he would use her connection to Aethys. Your sister has been distributing dangerous materials while you have been negotiating in apparent good faith. Does this not undermine your position as humanity's representative? Aethys recognized the trap, but couldn't stay silent. To remain mute would imply guilt or complicity. To speak would deplete her precious remaining words. Either way, Keelai won. Irrelevant to negotiations. Sovan nodded slightly. Approval, perhaps, of the economy and precision of Aethys's response. I disagree, Keelai responded. It speaks directly to human trustworthiness. Are you complicit in her activities or merely incompetent in your awareness of them? The false dichotomy hung in the air. From the corner of her eye, Aethys saw Iris's fingers twitch in a tiny movement. A signal she doesn't know. Before Aethys could respond, Iris spoke. She's not my sister.
The collar activated instantly. Iris's body convulsed as electricity coursed through her. Her face contorted in pain, though no sound escaped her lips. The human servants at the back of the room flinched collectively, a ripple of shared agony.
Stop!
Aethys cried, unable to contain herself at the sight of her sister's suffering. The shock ceased, leaving Iris trembling but upright. She straightened slowly, dignity reasserting itself in her posture. Ki Lai turned to the council with satisfaction.
As you can see, the technology functions as designed. I propose immediate implementation across all human sectors.
The council leader, Sovan, looked troubled.
This seems extreme. The existing collars maintain order adequately. The existing collars address only half the problem,
Ki Lai countered.
Humans have evolved methods to circumvent them. Security must evolve in response. This requires a formal vote,
Sovan insisted, her veins pulsing with an irregular pattern that suggested internal conflict.
Of course,
Ki Lai agreed smoothly.
And given the sensitivity of this decision, I suggest we broadcast it to demonstrate our commitment to security and transparency.
Young council member Talon appeared disturbed.
Should we not deliberate further? The implications of monitoring emotional states are necessary to prevent insurrection,
Ki Lai interrupted.
Unless you believe the comfort of humans outweighs the security of our civilization.
Talon subsided, though his veins pulsed with obvious discomfort. Aethys had seen this pattern before. Individual Valix might harbor doubts, even sympathy, but would rarely voice them when framed as a matter of security versus sentiment. The vote proceeded quickly. Despite evident discomfort from some members, the motion passed unanimously. No Valix would publicly oppose a measure presented as essential for security. Aethys stood frozen, watching her sister's face. To her surprise, she saw not defeat in Iris's eyes, but anticipation. Something was in motion that Ki Lai, for all his insight into human communication, had failed to detect. Technicians prepared the chamber for galaxy-wide broadcast. Aethys remained at her podium, her counter showing the handful of words she had remaining, rendered nearly useless now. One of the human servants, Elian, the young woman who had signaled to Aethys earlier, moved with subtle efficiency, adjusting lighting panels that gave her a view of multiple display screens. Her fingers moved in quick patterns when she thought no one was watching. Messages passing among the human staff, invisible to Valix observers. Ki Lai positioned himself before the broadcast array, adjusting his formal robes. The golden veins across his face pulsed with bright energy, the Valix equivalent of a flush of triumph.
Citizens of the unified territories,
he began, once the transmission indicators lit up.
Today marks an important advancement in our continuing efforts to maintain peace and stability across our world.
As Ki Lai continued his speech, reality crystallized in Aethys's mind with sudden clarity. These negotiations had never been intended to succeed. Her appointment as lead negotiator, despite her dwindling word count, hadn't been an honor, but a calculated move to neutralize humanity's voice. Her impending silence was not an unfortunate circumstance, but the very point of these proceedings. 26 years of careful diplomacy, of believing she was slowly improving conditions for her people. Had it all been theater? Had she been complicit in her own species' continued subjugation? She remembered her father's words before he went silent. Sometimes winning is to not play the game. She'd interpreted it as encouragement for her diplomatic career once. Now, watching Iris's composed face, she wondered if she misunderstood entirely.
The Council has unanimously approved implementation of enhanced communication monitoring for all human populations, Keli announced to the galaxy. This measure will ensure continued harmony and prevent dangerous misinformation from threatening our shared peace. Aethys felt a shift in the room's energy. Aethys observed the human servants lining the walls. They stood motionless, yet she detected a current of tension running through them, a collective awareness that something significant was unfolding. The Valix guards glanced at each other uncertainly. Something had changed, though nothing visible had happened. Elder Ramoru caught her watching the servants and raised an eyebrow slightly. He had always been the most perceptive of the council members. Sovan noticed it too. Her golden veins dimmed slightly as she scanned the room, sensing the altered atmosphere. She caught Aethys's eye, a question in her gaze. Keli continued, oblivious to the changing atmosphere. Distribution of the new collars will begin immediately in major population centers and proceed according to... In that moment, Aethys made her decision. Her remaining words would never sway the council, but perhaps they could serve a greater purpose. She stepped forward, moving directly into the broadcast frame beside Keli. His expression flickered with surprise, then irritation. Negotiator Rowe, this is not the appropriate... She held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the submissive behavior expected of humans, that he actually fell silent. The broadcast indicators glowed bright red on the camera array. Every planet, every settlement, every human wearing a collar would be watching. Keli faltered mid-sentence as Aethys appeared beside him in the transmission. Confusion flickered across his features, followed by annoyance at the interruption. Aethys faced the broadcast array directly. In her peripheral vision, she saw Iris straighten, eyes bright with anticipation. Elian and the other human servants had shifted almost imperceptibly, their attention razor-sharp despite their downcast eyes. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the collar, the weight of all it represented. Generations of enforced silence, of words counted and rationed, of voices strangled. She's down to her last words. She better make it count. Congratulations! You just declared war on the wrong species. Her collar activated immediately, sending the final pulse that would permanently disable her vocal cords. A sharp pain flared in her throat, then subsided to numbness. Sovan rose from her seat, golden veins pulsing with alarm. What does she mean? What is happening? Keli recovered quickly, gesturing for guards to remove Aethys from the broadcast frame. A disappointing outburst from the human negotiator. This only underscores the necessity of our new security measures. He stopped abruptly as the chamber doors opened. Human staff members from throughout the government complex entered silently, forming a line around the perimeter of the room. They linked hands, their expressions resolute. Remove them immediately, Keli commanded, but the guards hesitated, uncertain how to respond to this peaceful, silent demonstration. The humans made no aggressive moves. They simply stood, hands linked, gazes steady. Some wore service uniforms, others administrative attire, representatives of every level of the bureaucracy that kept the Valix civilization functioning. The council members shifted uncomfortably. Sovan rose from her seat. What is the meaning of this? No one answered. No one needed to. On the monitor displays around the chamber, feeds from across the capital city showed humans emerging from buildings, linking hands in silent chains that stretched down boulevards and across plazas. No shouting, no violence, just silent, unified presence. Further images appeared from around the world. Humans from the mining industrial cities of Nevada stood motionless beside extraction equipment. In the agricultural domes of Heilongjiang, Field workers lined up at the edges of the vast plantations. On the orbital platforms, maintenance crews gathered in the common areas. Everywhere, humans stopped working. They simply stood together, hands linked, refusing to participate in the machinery of their own oppression. "This is absurd," Keli sputtered, his veins pulsing erratically. "They're functioning as a collective entity. Precisely what the collars were designed to prevent." Aethys caught Iris's eye across the chamber. Her sister's face showed a fierce pride. This had been the plan all along. Not a violent uprising, but a demonstration that silence could be more powerful than words, that a species-denied voice would find other ways to speak. "We should activate the emergency protocols," Keli insisted. "Security teams in every sector. Mandatory compliance measures." "To what end?" Elder Ramoru interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Would you have us shock every human simultaneously? Force them physically back to their tasks? Create martyrs?" A young Valix council member stood, veins pulsing with agitation. "They're just standing there. They're not doing anything illegal. They're refusing to work," Keli snapped. "That's insurrection." "It's choice," Sovan countered quietly. "We cannot force them to work without becoming something we've claimed not to be." The implication hung in the air, that beneath the veneer of benevolent oversight, the relationship between the Valix and humans had always been one of control, not protection. Aethys moved across the chamber to where Iris stood. Without hesitation, she took her sister's hand. The gesture bridged 15 years of separation, of different paths chosen from the same starting point. Iris squeezed her hand tightly, the pressure conveying everything words could not. Understanding, recognition that each had fought in her own way for the same ultimate goal. The human servants in the chamber joined them, forming an unbroken circle around the council platform. Elian stepped forward to take Aethys's other hand, completing the chain. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence held weight, carried meaning no words could have conveyed. In the stillness, the sound of Valix breathing seemed suddenly loud, their golden veins pulsing with emotions too complex for humans to fully interpret. Finally, Sovan sighed, golden veins dimming slightly with resignation. "Remove the experimental collar from the prisoner." Keli started to object, but Sovan cut him off with a sharp gesture. "This demonstration has failed, Keli. We must reconsider our approach." A guard stepped forward, deactivating Iris's new collar and replacing it with her standard one. It was a small concession, but it represented something monumental. The first acknowledgement that the Valix had heard humanity's silent voice. As the guard worked, Iris's eyes never left Aethys's face. When the standard collar was secured, she mouthed 2 words silently, meant only for her sister. "Thank you." Aethys nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of peace despite the permanence of her silence. Her diplomatic career was over, but perhaps she had finally accomplished what she'd always intended, creating space for actual change, not just the illusion of it. Elder Ramoru stepped down from the council platform, approaching the sisters with measured steps. His ancient eyes moved between them, as if seeing something others could not. "The collars were meant to prevent another war," he said, his voice carrying none of Keli's defensiveness, only tired wisdom. "To save both our species from what words can incite." Iris met his gaze steadily. "Not words. Haste, imbalance, control." The elder Valix considered this, veins pulsing slowly with contemplation. Perhaps we should discuss this further with those who still have words to speak. It wasn't victory. It wasn't freedom, but it was acknowledgement, the beginning of actual dialogue rather than controlled negotiation. Aethys knew this was just the beginning. The path ahead would be difficult, perhaps bloody. Keli and others like him wouldn't surrender control easily. Some humans might not be satisfied with peaceful resistance indefinitely. But as she stood hand in hand with her sister, surrounded by humans standing in silent solidarity across the galaxy, she understood a truth the Valix had never grasped. You can never silence humanity. In her enforced muteness, Aethys had never felt more eloquent. In the loss of her voice, she had finally found it.